In 1930s Harlem, respect wasn't something you asked for, it was something you defended. And on one unforgettable night, inside the most famous ballroom in New York, a single act of disrespect nearly turned into a death sentence. This is the story of a mobster who thought he could humiliate a legend and the man who reminded him that Harlem had its own rules. The Savoy Ballroom was alive that night. Music filled the air. Feet moved across the polished floor. And for a few precious hours, the world outside didn't exist. Black and white dancers shared the same space. Something rare and dangerous in those days. On stage sat Duke Ellington, hands gliding over the piano, leading his orchestra like only he could. He wasn't just playing music. He was representing pride, talent, and black excellence in a country that often refused to see it. Watching quietly from the back of the room was a man most people never noticed until it was too late. Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't there to dance. He wasn't there to drink. He was there to observe. Harlem knew him as a protector, not because he was loud or flashy, but because when lines were crossed, he made sure they were never crossed again. Unlike other gangsters of his time, Bumpy didn't rely on guns. He carried something older, quieter, and far more personal. Near the stage sat Vince Vic the Blade Romano, a mobster connected to Dutch Schultz's crew. Drunk, arrogant, and surrounded by armed men, Vic believed Harlem was just another place to show power. All night, his table laughed too loud, mocked too freely, and pushed boundaries no one else dared to push. Bumpy noticed. Harlem noticed. The music kept playing, but tension was building. Then it happened. In the middle of Duke Ellington's performance, Vic stood up, popped a champagne bottle, and sprayed across the stage. The liquid soaked Duke's suit, splashed his piano, and froze the room in silence. What Vic thought was a joke felt like a slap in the face to everyone watching. The orchestra stopped. The dancers froze. The joy vanished in an instant. That's when Bumpy Johnson moved. His footsteps echoed across the floor as people instinctively stepped aside. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was calm, and that made it worse. His hand rested at his waist, not reaching for a gun, but for something far more frightening to those who knew his reputation. The mobster laughed at first, until he saw Bumpy's eyes. Because in that moment, Vic Romano realized something too late. He wasn't in Little Italy. He wasn't protected by his connections. And whatever Bumpy Johnson was about to do, there would be no going back. What happened next turned into Harlem legend. Bumpy Johnson had spent most of his life learning how power really worked. Not the kind that came from money or guns, but the kind that lived in silence, patience, and reputation. In Harlem, his name carried weight because he didn't act without reason. Every move was measured. Every response had purpose. That night at the Savoy, as he stood face to face with Vic Romano, all of that history sat quietly behind his calm expression. Vic, on the other hand, came from a different world. Raised in the shadow of New York's Italian mob, he was used to intimidation doing the talking. His nickname, the Blade, wasn't earned through honor, but through cruelty. In places like the Bronx or downtown Manhattan, his presence alone was enough to make people look away. Harlem, he believed, would be no different. He assumed the music, the dancing, the smiles were signs of weakness. He assumed wrong. The Savoy Ballroom wasn't just a club. It was a symbol for Black Harlem. It represented freedom in a time when freedom was tightly controlled. Musicians like Duke Ellington didn't just perform there. They stood tall there. Every note played on that stage carried pride, struggle, and survival. That's why the champagne stunt hit harder than Vic ever realized. It wasn't just an insult to a man. It was an insult to a community. As Bumpy stood near Vic's table, the silence in the room grew heavier. People could feel something turning, like air before a storm. Even Vic's own men stopped smiling. They'd heard stories too. Stories about how Harlem answered disrespect. Stories about how problems didn't always end with police reports. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He let the moment stretch, letting fear do the work for him. Duke Ellington remained on the stage, frozen between dignity and disbelief. Years of performing had taught him how to swallow humiliation, how to keep going when disrespected. But this was different. This time, someone had stepped forward for him. Someone was saying, without words, that this moment mattered. Vic tried to speak. try to regain control, but confidence drained from his voice. He glanced around the room, expecting support, expecting fear from the crowd. Instead, he saw something worse. Unity, eyes watching, waiting, remembering. Harlem wasn't backing down. Bumpy leaned in just enough for Vic to understand that this wasn't theater. This wasn't a bluff. Whatever happened next would echo far beyond the walls of Savoy, beyond this night, beyond this room. And as the tension tightened, one truth became painfully clear to everyone watching. This confrontation wasn't about champagne anymore. It was about respect. And respect in Harlem always came at a price. The longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable it became. People shifted in their seats, afraid to move, afraid not to. Dancers near the floor clutched each other's hands, unsure whether the music would ever start again. The Savoy had seen plenty of tense moments over the years, but this one felt different. This wasn't a loud argument or a public scene. This was quiet, controlled, and far more dangerous. Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still, his presence alone commanding the room. Those who knew him understood what that calm meant. He wasn't deciding whether to act. He was deciding how. In Harlem, Bumpy had built his reputation by solving problems in ways that sent messages without needing explanations. People followed him not out of fear alone, but because he stood for something. Order, respect, protection. Vic Romano felt that shift even if he didn't fully understand it. His eyes darted around the ballroom, searching for reassurance from his men. They were armed, sure, but none of them moved. They knew guns at a place like the Savoy would bring chaos, police, headlines, and worse, consequences they couldn't escape. This wasn't their territory. Every instinct told them they were standing on the wrong ground. From the stage, Duke Ellington watched it all unfold. He had spent his career mastering restraint, learning how to endure insult with grace. But as he looked at Bumpy, something unfamiliar stirred inside him. This wasn't pity. This was solidarity. For once, the burden of silence wasn't his alone. Someone else had stepped into the space between dignity and danger. In the crowd, whispers began to spread, barely audible but impossible to stop. Names were murmured, stories remembered. People recalled what happened to those who ignored Harlem's unwritten rules. These weren't fairy tales meant to scare children. They were warnings passed down quietly, meant to keep the peace. The Savoy itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls knew history was being written. Vic tried to laugh again, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The confidence he carried into the ballroom was gone, replaced by the realization that power worked differently here. In Harlem, it wasn't about who you knew downtown. It was about who stood behind you when things went wrong. And in this room, no one was standing behind him. Bumpy finally shifted his weight, just slightly. It was a small movement, but it sent a ripple through the crowd. Whatever came next wouldn't just settle a score. It would send a message far beyond the Savoy, because everyone there understood one thing. What happened in the next few moments would decide who truly ruled Harlem. The air inside the Savoy felt thick now, like it was pressing down on everyone's chest. Time slowed in strange ways. Seconds dragged, yet no one dared look away. Bumpy Johnson remained calm, almost relaxed, but that calm carried weight. It was the kind of quiet that made people nervous, the kind that told you something serious was about to happen. Vic Romano swallowed hard. He had walked into Savoy feeling untouchable, backed by reputation and connections that ruled much in New York. But standing here, surrounded by unfamiliar faces that showed no fear, he felt exposed. This wasn't a crowd he could bully. These people weren't impressed by his name or his crew. They were watching Bumpy, waiting to see what line would be drawn. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice low and steady, forcing Vic to lean in just to hear him. That alone shifted the balance. When a man like Bumpy didn't raise his voice, it meant he didn't need to. Every word landed heavier than shouting ever could. The crowd leaned forward, listening without meaning to. Even the band members on stage felt pulled into the moment. From where he stood, Duke Ellington could see the tension tightening like a wire ready to snap. His hands hovered near the piano keys, unsure whether music would ever return to this room the same way again. Part of him wanted to look away. Another part needed to witness it. Whatever happened next would stay with him forever. Vic's men shifted uncomfortably, hands close to their coats, but no one moved. They understood the unspoken rules too. Any sudden action here would turn a bad night into a disaster. Police attention, mob retaliation, a war no one wanted. Harlem wasn't worth that risk. Not tonight. The whispers in the crowd stopped. Silence took over completely. Bumpy's eyes never left Vic's face, studying him, measuring him. This wasn't anger. This was judgment, the kind that decided futures. Vic opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He realized he was being given a moment, maybe his last chance to choose wisely. Pride urged him to push back. Survival begged him to stand down. The struggle played out on his face for everyone to see. Bumpy shifted one step closer. Not threatening, not rushed, just close enough to remind Vic that distance was gone and control had changed hands. Somewhere deep in Savoy, a glass clinked by accident and the sound echoed like thunder. Hearts raced, breaths were held, because the next word spoken in that ballroom wouldn't just end a confrontation. They would decide whether this night became a warning or a legend. Bumpy's calm stare never wavered, but something unexpected shifted the moment even further. From the back of the ballroom, a man in a dark suit quietly slipped toward the exit. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Bumpy caught it. So did a few others who understood how these nights usually ended. Someone was trying to leave early, not out of fear, but to carry a message beyond the Savoy's walls. That changed everything. If word reached the wrong ears, this wouldn't stay contained inside one ballroom. Names like Dutch Schultz didn't sit quietly when they felt challenged. Harlem knew that too. The crowd sensed it, the tension rising another level. This was no longer just
You
about
can't
one
keep avoiding
mobster
this.
and one
What
insult.
choice do I have?
This moment had
Face the
potential
consequences.
to spark
Not that
something
simple.
much bigger. Vic Romano noticed a shift as well. He glanced toward the door, then back at Bumpy, realizing the situation was slipping beyond his control. His face tightened. If his people outside got the wrong idea, things could spiral fast. He wasn't just worried about what Bumpy might do. He was worried about what his own world would demand afterward. On the stage, Duke Ellington felt the weight of that realization without fully understanding it. He could sense that this night was crossing into dangerous territory, where pride, power, and politics tangled together. He had spent his life turning tension into music. But this was a rhythm he couldn't play his way out of. Bumpy spoke again, quietly enough that only Vic could hear. Whatever he said made Vic stiffen. The crowd couldn't catch the words, but they didn't need to. The change in Vic's expression said enough. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely, replaced by calculation and fear. He wasn't thinking about saving face anymore. He was thinking about surviving what came next. Around the room, people exchanged looks. Some had seen this before. Moments when one decision split history in two. Harlem had been pushed, challenged, underestimated too many times. Tonight felt like one of those moments when patience ran out. Bumpy's presence grew heavier, not louder. He stood as if the entire ballroom rested on his shoulders. Protector, judge, line in the sand. Whatever choice Vic made next would echo far beyond Savoy, far beyond this night of music and dancing. Vic drew in a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew backing down would cost him reputation. Standing his ground could cost him everything else. His men waited, frozen, afraid to act without a signal that never came. The room held its breath again, because now the question wasn't whether someone had crossed a line. The question was whether Harlem was about to remind the world what happened when that line was ignored. Vic Romano finally broke, not with anger, not with threats, but with something far rarer in his world, hesitation. His shoulders dropped just slightly, enough for Bumpy to notice, enough for everyone watching to feel the shift. Power had changed hands, not through force, but through certainty. Vic understood now that this was a fight he could win, no matter how many names he dropped or men he brought with him. In a voice that struggled to stay steady, Vic spoke, trying to turn the moment into something smaller than it was. A misunderstanding, a bad joke, too much champagne. But the words landed flat. The Savoy didn't accept excuses that night. This wasn't about drinks or ego. This was about respect, and respect had already been violated. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Vic finished, Bumpy stepped closer, close enough that only the two of them could hear each other. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a finality that made Vic's stomach tighten. Bumpy made it clear that Harlem wasn't a playground, and the Savoy wasn't a place where anyone got to humiliate its people and walk away untouched. Not physically harmed, but marked in a way that followed you. Then came the moment no one expected. Bumpy turned away from Vic and looked toward the stage, toward Duke Ellington. The room followed his gaze. Duke stood tall, still damp from the champagne, but dignified as ever. Bumpy gave him the choice. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a simple question that handed control back to the man who had been disrespected. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Duke took a breath. Years of swallowed anger and practiced restraint sat behind his eyes. Then he spoke. He didn't demand punishment. He didn't call for revenge. He asked for an apology. A real one, in front of everyone. Vic froze. This wasn't what he expected. It was worse. An apology would strip him of pride in front of Harlem, in front of his own men. But refusing would mean crossing a line he now knew better than to cross. Slowly, painfully, Vic turned toward the stage and spoke the words. They weren't perfect. They weren't proud, but they were enough. The Savoy heard them. Harlem heard them. The tension eased, but it didn't disappear. Bumpy nodded once. The matter was settled for tonight. Vic and his crew were escorted out under watchful eyes, their exit quiet, almost shameful. No cheers, no celebration, just understanding. As Duke returned to the piano, his fingers touched the keys again, and music filled the room, stronger than before. But the final twist lingered in the air, because everyone there knew the truth. Vic Romano walked out alive, but his reputation didn't, and the message sent that night would travel far beyond the Savoy. The music rolled back into Savoy like a deep breath after nearly drowning. Duke Ellington played with a steadiness that came from something stronger than confidence. Every note carried relief, pride, and a quiet victory. The dancers slowly returned to the floor, cautious at first, then freer, as if the room itself had been given permission to live again. What had happened would not be announced on the stage, but everyone felt it. The Savoy had been tested, and it had held. Bumpy Johnson drifted back to his place along the wall, the same spot where he had started the night. To most eyes, he looked unchanged, calm, observant, distant. But those who knew him understood that nights like this never truly ended. They only moved forward. He watched the crowd, making sure the balance returned, making sure no one felt afraid. Protection didn't end with confrontation. It ended when peace did. Vic Romano and his men didn't look back as they left Harlem. They didn't run, but they walked fast, quieter than when they arrived. By morning, the story would already be spreading through the city's back channels. Not exaggerated, not softened, just repeated carefully. The Savoy, Duke Ellington, Bumpy Johnson, a warning wrapped in a lesson. Harlem was not open territory. Respect was not optional. In the days that followed, nothing seemed different on the surface. The Savoy stayed open. The music played. Harlem moved the way it always did. But something had shifted underneath. Numbers runners talked a little differently. Club owners stood a little straighter. Performers felt seen in a way they hadn't before. The message had settled in, quiet and firm. Duke Ellington never spoke publicly about that night. He didn't need to. It lived in the way he played afterward. There was more weight in his performances, more certainty. He had always known who he was, but that night reminded him that his work mattered beyond applause. It mattered because it carried a people's voice. And for once, that voice had been defended without compromise. Bumpy and Duke crossed paths again weeks later, briefly, without ceremony. A nod, a shared understanding. No long conversations. Men like them didn't need speeches. What mattered had already been said in silence. For Bumpy Johnson, the Savoy incident became one more moment in a long life shaped by hard choices. He wasn't proud of violence, and he wasn't chasing legend. He believed in boundaries, in lines that, once crossed, had to be answered. Harlem had given him purpose, and he returned it with loyalty. That night wasn't about ego. It was about making sure the next insult never happened. Years later, when Harlem changed and the world shifted again, people still talk about that night in lowered voices, not because of fear, but because of respect. It became a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it stands quietly in the back of the room, watching, waiting, ready to act only when it must. Vic Romano faded into the background of New York's criminal history. He survived, but survival came at a cost. Doors closed, trust thinned. The city remembered who had been humbled and where. Harlem wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It was a line you didn't cross without permission. And that may be the lasting truth of the story. Not that one man stood up to another, but that a community was defended without apology. Music was protected. Dignity was restored. And everyone who witnessed it learned something simple but powerful. Respect travels faster than fear. Silence can be louder than threats. And leadership isn't about taking. It's about standing between harm and the people who can't afford to be harmed. On one night in 1930s Harlem, inside a ballroom filled with music, Bumpy Johnson made sure that lesson was understood, not with chaos, not with headlines, but with calm resolve and an unspoken promise. Some places protect their own, and some moments never stop echoing.